So this is the audio version of 113 words and phrases related to neurodivergence that are going to come in useful when you start doing your own research and your own deep dive into all things neurodivergence related. Sometimes the language used around neurodiversity can seem impenetrable, especially if you've just received a diagnosis or you're at the start of your journey to self-identify as a neurodivergent person. So, this little glossary aims to simplify and de-pathologise, that means make it sound much less negative and more realistic, some of the terminology to help support you when you do your own deep dive into the subject. I'm also going to outline some of the hot button topics in the area of neurodivergence so you can understand some of the arguments around the way that neurodivergence is presented. I've tried to include common strengths and challenges of each of the neurodivergent conditions listed, but I do need to make it clear not everybody who is neurodivergent will have the same experience of being neurodivergent. As the saying goes, if you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. Everyone is completely unique and will have their own unique understanding of what it means to be neurodivergent to them. Additionally, I've tried to be neuro-affirmative and I've tried to remind people of the positive aspects of being neurodivergent as well as some of the challenges. But I am still, and we all are, learning. So if there's a way I can phrase something better or there's something I've said that's problematic and I haven't realized, please let me know how I could write it more sensitively. And I'd really appreciate any feedback so the resources can be continually improved and evolved. If the term has a star, a little asterisk after it, there's an additional short video available on my channels or in the area of the course, if that's where you're finding this video, if you want to have a little dive in further. Number 1, ableism. Ableism refers to discrimination, prejudice, and stigma against individuals with disabilities, which may include neurodivergent conditions, depending on how an individual views their neurodivergence. Not every neurodivergent person identifies as disabled. However, ADHD and autism are covered under the Equalities Act. Activities of daily living are essential tasks and routines that you perform to maintain your personal health and well-being. So that includes eating, dressing, bathing, grooming, managing your environment, going to the toilet, being able to do things without falls, and being able to go out to the community, being able to form relationships, all of the things that people do on a day-to-day basis. ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and in my humble opinion, is the most badly named of the neurodivergent conditions. Firstly, doesn't mean that you lack attention, although you might not be able to direct it where you want it. In fact, there is such a thing as hyperfocus, and I'm going to come to that a little bit later. Many advocates also argue it's a neurodevelopmental difference, not a disorder. So, individuals with ADHD exhibit diverse attention styles and can often also have heightened creativity and can demonstrate intense passions and energy for their interests. However, there are challenges to having ADHD, and that might include difficulties with sustained attention, keeping your attention on one thing, impulsivity, doing things without thinking them through, and executive functioning, which I'm going to come to later. And that can impact various aspects of your daily life, including your academic performance, work productivity, and interpersonal relationships without support. Accessibility within neurodiversity issues means creating environments, products, and services that can accommodate individuals with neurological differences and their diverse needs and preferences. And that includes implementing adjustments such as sensory friendly design, clear communication strategies, flexible work arrangements. Some of the shops now do quiet shopping time. There are some cinemas that have stimming and noise um, showings of films. So we are starting to move in that direction, but we're still a long way from making it fully accessible for a lot of neurodivergent people. But the idea is that neurodivergent people can fully participate and engage in activities and community resources without encountering any unnecessary barriers or discrimination. ADHD tax. This is an informal saying. It's not really a government tax, but it's the extra time, effort, and financial costs that individuals with ADHD often incur because of challenges related to attention, organisation, and executive functioning. It might also relate to impulsive spending, but it can include things like late fees, lost item costs, and expenses for strategies and tools to manage ADHD symptoms. Advocacy in terms of neurodivergence involves actively supporting the rights, inclusion, and acceptance of neurodivergent individuals. That includes raising awareness about neurodiversity, challenging stigma and discrimination, promoting access to resources and accommodations, and empowering neurodivergent individuals to advocate for themselves and others within society, education, employment, and healthcare systems. Alexithymia, for which I have another short video, is characterized by difficulties in understanding and expressing your emotions. So people with alexithymia are often also neurodivergent, but they don't have to be. And they have trouble recognizing their own feelings and distinguishing between different emotions. Allistic simply describes anyone who's not autistic, even if they have another neurodivergent condition. So you can be ADHD and allistic, or you can have dyspraxia and be allistic. It's just anyone who does not have an autistic identity. Allyship is the offer of support, solidarity, and advocacy to neurodivergent individuals. So, recognizing and respecting their experiences, their perspectives, and their rights. Aphantasia, again, got a short little video, is a cognitive trait that's characterized by the absence or limited ability to generate visual mental imagery, affirming diverse ways of experiencing and processing information beyond visual perception. It's very unusual for someone with aphantasia to not be able to use one of their senses in their mind's eye. But essentially, what it means is if they have their eyes closed and they are attempting to visualize something, they will not be able to do it in such a way that it brings up a particular image to mind. That doesn't mean to say they can't think about the subject, but they're unlikely to have a visual representation or model. Asperger syndrome. Asperger's was previously considered a distinct condition from autism and described autistic people with high level language skills and average to high intellectual abilities. Difficulties with the term Asperger syndrome arise from its historical association with Hans Asperger, who was the man in the picture, who was a Nazi era Austrian pediatrician, and his work contributed to some of the harmful eugenics policies of the Nazi regime. What is of note is, although there are difficulties, some people still identify with the term Asperger syndrome to describe their experiences and find their community. And what I will say is, it's essential to respect individuals' autonomy and self description. It's their condition, it's the way that they function. They are allowed to self identify however they want. And we can acknowledge the problematic history and connotations associated with the terms, whilst also respecting people's autonomy to identify however it is they wish to identify. Anoralia is the absence of auditory imagery. So most people can imagine voices, music, or sounds in their mind's ear, but not everyone. It's not universal. Some people describe this silent inner world as anoralia. ARFID, sometimes considered a neurodivergent condition in its own right, stands for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder, and it's characterized by challenges relating to eating and food intake. It's not about body image concerns, but rather it's about sensory sensitivities, fear of aversive consequences. So, for example, if someone has a fear of vomiting or a lack of interest in eating entirely, limited calorie intake can lead to nutritional deficiencies and impairment in daily functioning. So, if you're not eating enough, you're going to run out of energy. So, I would say that that is something that could be addressed. ADHD is an informal way of saying someone's both autistic and ADHD. Auditory processing disorder is difficulty understanding and interpreting auditory information, even though your hearing's of a normal range and ability. It can result in difficulty following verbal instructions. You might get distracted by background noise, and you might need things to be repeated. This one's problematic. Aspie supremacy. So this was explained by A.J. Singh of Mind Bodies Decolonized. And this is how they phrased it. They said, Aspie supremacy is a term that refers to how some low support needs autistics believe themselves to be superior to high support needs autistics and to non-autistics. They emphasize the savant narrative, focus only on autistics who are gifted, and tend to refer to themselves as high functioning. So what that means is people who don't need a lot of support to get on with their day-to-day lives and may have a particular area of skill look down on people who don't have this particular area of skill or expertise, or might need a little bit more help in their day-to-day life. So obviously that's problematic in the extreme, not least because it devalues disabled people who have higher support needs. Autism is a neurodevelopmental variation, and it's characterized by communication, social interaction, sensory processing, and behavior differences when compared to those of neurotypical people. The phrase autism mom, dad, parent is often used by mothers to express their identity as parents of autistic children, but it has several implications that can be really harmful or dismissive to the autistic community. It focuses on the parent's experience over that of the autistic individual, and it often portrays the autistic persona as a burden on the parent, or the parent as a martyr. And it also feels a little bit to some as though the autistic identity is being co opted by the parent. And that can result in the adoption of some problematic, I'm putting it in inverted commas, therapies that the autistic community consider harmful. On a more positive note, autistic joy is the profound sense of happiness and well-being experienced by some autistic people, characterized by unique expressions of joy. And this term was coined by autistic writers and activists, and it emphasizes the value of these expressions as authentic manifestations of happiness. And they're often linked to special interests. Autism Speaks. Uh, Autism advocacy experts and many in the autistic community have expressed significant criticism and concerns about Autism Speaks, and there are several reasons for this. The organisation's approach, messaging, and practices are the source of contention because they've historically emphasised trying to find a cure for autism, and they've framed it as a disease or a condition that needs to be eradicated. They often use fear-based language and imagery that portrays autism in a negative light, and that contributes to misunderstanding and stigma rather than acceptance and conclusion. There's also a massive lack of autistic representation within the organisation, and there's significant concerns about how their budget is spent. But I'll let you do your own research. Autobiographical memory is the ability to recall personal experiences and events from the past. We all have variations in our autobiographical memory, but they are particularly strong in a lot of neurodivergent people. And that can result in challenges with organising and retrieving memories. So, knowing when you did what or pulling out a particular memory that someone else might be telling you about. So, you can get fragmented or less detailed recollections of past events. Fear theory. I've got a video, shorter video, stating where this came from and explaining it in a bit more detail, but it is brilliant. It's a popular theory to explain neurodivergent capacities and burnout. So the beer theory is an analogy that illustrates the concept of energy limitations and pacing for people with chronic illnesses or disabilities to those without. So if you compare your ability to consume alcohol to your daily functioning capacity, it highlights the importance of understanding what is sustainable. So you could only drink a certain number of pints before it all went to, hell in a handbasket and you felt very poorly. Um, and it's the same with having a sustainable activity level. How much should you be doing to make sure that you are not burning yourself out? And it's about the cumulative impact of exertion over time. Body doubling is a supportive technique that involves another person's physical presence to help increase focus, productivity, or comfort. And it respects your individual preference and asks, what do you need to help you complete your task? There are quite a few body doubling apps out there, and there are some that are free. And from the feedback, informal, I haven't done any research on it. It's really effective in supporting people with ADHD when they get a bit of task paralysis. Bottom up thinking, or flipped triangle thinking, or if you want to be fancy, gestalt processing, is an approach to problem solving and information processing that starts with the detail and the observations and the sensory input before synthesizing into bigger concepts or ideas. So you start with the very fine detail and make it into a more generalized um, idea or concept later. A lot of people who are neurodivergent, I would say the majority, tend to have bottom up thinking patterns, whereas it seems that top down, so think of the big picture, the mission statement, and then drill down into the fine detail, tends to be more common in neurotypical people. Camouflaging refers to the practice of masking or hiding your neurodivergent traits and behaviors in social situations. Cassandra syndrome is a bit controversial, but it's interesting. It's where neurotypical partners of individuals with unidentified autism um, find their relationship concerns are disbelieved. So when they begin to realize their partner's neurodivergent and try to explain to other people what their life is like with an autistic partner, nobody believes them. Um, that could well be because the other person is very high masking. It's a controversial term. Some see it as excluding people who don't identify as female or don't present as cisgender or don't present as heterosexual, but interesting nonetheless. Central auditory processing disorder is difficulty processing auditory information despite average hearing ability. It can result in difficulty processing auditory sequences, trouble filtering background noise, difficulty in discriminating between similar sounds, um, delayed processing of auditory information, and might lead to struggles with complex directions. Jewelry. Um, that's objects that provide sensory input through chewing, and it's often used by neurodivergent people to self regulate and manage their sensory needs. It can help reduce anxiety and can improve focus. It can be bought in the form of fashion jewellery, like the one to the right, so it's not just for kids. Cognitive empathy and emotional empathy are two distinct forms of empathy, and each of them have unique advantages. So, cognitive empathy, also known as perspective taking, means you think about the other person's thoughts, feelings, and perspectives, but you don't need to share their emotions. Emotional empathy, also known as affective empathy, involves sharing and deeply feeling another person's emotions. It's the ability to emotionally resonate with other people's experiences. Not directly linked to neurodivergence, but there is a high rate of prevalence in the neurodivergent community. So I just wanted to put this one in here. Okay. Complex post traumatic stress disorder um, is where you have experienced trauma both in childhood and adulthood. And people with CPTSD can experience intense emotions like chronic sadness, anger, fear, and they might struggle to regulate those emotions. There's often a level of negative self perception, poor self esteem, and they might feel worthless or guilty. Might be difficult to maintain relationships because they might have difficulties trusting people, or there might be attachment difficulties or difficulty setting boundaries. And the reason neurodivergent people may be more susceptible to experiencing trauma is due to social misunderstanding, bullying, exclusion, or abuse, all of which we know have a higher prevalence in the neurodivergent community. And those experiences can, but don't always, contribute to the development of CPTSD. Cycling is the process of experiencing recurring patterns of mood, energy levels, or behavioral states. In a neurodivergent context, this can refer to fluctuations in focus, motivation, emotional state, and it occurs regularly and it can impact your daily functioning. Declarative language is a form of communication that involves sharing information, experiences, or feelings rather than giving directives or asking questions. So things like, I remember a time when I took a shower and it felt, rather than go and take a shower. Um, there are some really good books out there on this subject, one of which is The Explosive Child, which I know doesn't necessarily relate to adults, but well worth a read. Developmental coordination disorder is a neurological condition that affects your fine and your gross motor skills, and it can make tasks that require coordination challenging. Diagnosis is the formal identification of a neurodivergent or mental health condition by a qualified professional, and it's based on a comprehensive evaluation of symptoms, history, and functioning. A diagnosis can provide validation and access to appropriate support and accommodations, different from the assessment, which is the gathering of the detailed information through various methods. So, interviews, observations, tests, scales, all that kind of thing, to understand an individual's strengths, challenges, and needs. Diagnosis is the outcome of the assessment, where a specific condition is identified. Disability advocacy is the efforts aimed at promoting the rights, inclusion, and well-being of individuals with disabilities. Disability advocacy emphasises empowerment, self-determination, and creating changes to our systems to make things more equitable and accessible as a society. Doom piles. I have loads of these. It's accumulations of clutter or unfinished tasks, and it can feel overwhelming or unmanageable. So you put things into a pile that you're going to deal with later, and then there's several piles, and then it does feel like there's a lot of piles. The double empathy problem is a concept that suggests when there is what I'll call cross neurotype communication. What I mean by that is between people who are neurodivergent and neurotypical, it was originally thought that it was deficits on the part of the neurodivergent person. We now know that's not true. It's actually mutual misunderstandings. So one is speaking a slightly different language from the other. And that's due to differences in social and communication expression on both sides, though. So, what that highlights is there needs to be a reciprocal understanding and respect for diverse perspectives. Um, it's not just all on the neurodivergent person to work out what the neurotypical person is meaning. Dyscalculia is a learning difference and it affects your ability to understand and perform mathematical tasks. People with dyscalculia often have unique problem solving strategies because they find alternative methods to navigate numerical tasks, and they can have very strong verbal skills, be excellent in reading, writing, communication, that sort of thing. Dysgraphia is a learning difference that impacts writing abilities, and that can include handwriting, spelling, anything to do with organising thoughts on paper. Many people with dysgraphia, though, become really proficient at using technology. So things like speech to text software or graphic organizers and other assistive technologies to aid their writing. Dyslexia is a learning difference and it's characterized by differences in reading and sometimes difficulties with word recognition, decoding words, and understanding them. However, people with dyslexia often have excellent spatial reasoning skills, which can be beneficial in things like engineering, architecture, and the visual arts. Dyspraxia is a neurodevelopmental condition that affects motor planning and coordination. So things like writing, tying shoelaces, using utensils, in the case of the picture, threading a needle. Um, but often you'll find that someone with dyspraxia shows a great deal of determination and resilience because they've had to work really hard to overcome their motor challenges. Echolalia is the repetition of words or phrases spoken by others, often observed in autistic individuals. So they can use it as a form of self regulation, as a form of information processing, or, a meaningful form of communication. Emotion regulation is the ability to manage and respond to emotional experiences in a balanced way. Being neurodivergent can affect the way that you regulate emotions. The Equalities Act, UK legislation designed to protect individuals from discrimination and promote equality across various domains. It includes disability. The Act underscores the importance of legal protections and societal commitment to ensuring fair treatment and opportunities for everyone. Executive function, or often in my case, executive dysfunction. It's a set of cognitive processes that allow you to plan, organize, problem solve, and decision make. And actually, willpower falls into the executive functioning category. When you recognize challenges with executive function, you emphasize the need for strategies. Um, and really, by supporting people's executive function, we can accommodate diverse cognitive styles, and that will enhance people's daily functioning and well-being. Face blindness, or prosopagnosia, I believe, is a neurological condition, and it means you can't necessarily recognize faces. It's more common in the neurodivergent population, but when you rely less on faces for identification, you can improve memory for other personal details, so names, habits, or specific interactions, which can enhance your social interactions in different ways. Floordro. It's a playful term describing clothes that are stored on the floor rather than in the wardrobe, and recognises the diverse organisational styles and natural variation in how we manage our living spaces. Generalised anxiety disorder. I put this here not because being neurodivergent in and of itself causes generalised anxiety disorder, but because, again, due to the systemic difficulties that a lot of neurodivergent people face, um, there's a higher percentage of people who also have generalized anxiety disorder. And it's a condition that is characterized by persistent and excessive worry about various aspects of life, often catastrophizing. Um, and we need to really understand the heightened sensitivity and awareness that can come with neurodivergent experiences so that we can tailor our support strategies. High and low support needs are terms that are used to explain the varying levels of assistance you might require in different areas of life. If we emphasize the support need rather than the functioning label, which isn't popular among the neurodivergent community, we can focus on how we can get the environment to provide adequate support rather than it being the responsibility of the individual. Hyperfixation is an intense and focused interest in a particular subject or activity, and it can bring immense joy and satisfaction. It highlights passion and engagement that some neurodivergent people experience. Hyperfocus is a state of deep concentration on a task or activity, often resulting in high productivity and creativity. This can be a valuable strength and allows people to immerse themselves fully in interesting projects, sometimes called a flow state. Hyper or hypoempathy shows the variations in emotional sensitivity and responsiveness. If you're hyper empathetic, you have really heightened emotional responses and you really feel for others, while hypo empathy, you might have less noticeable emotional reactions to others. Hyperlexia is the ability to read words significantly above the expected level for the age or cognitive ability. Um, but it is often accompanied by other challenges in areas of language and communication. Hyper and hyposensitivities are really important. It's what we commonly talk about when we're talking about sensory seeking or being sensory avoidant. And differences in sensory processing, where people can seek out intense sensory experiences or avoid specific sensory inputs, um, are common. And recognizing these sensitivities is really important for us to be able to access um, and manage our environments. Identity first language is a linguistic preference that places the condition before the individual, so autistic person, rather than person with autism. And it affirms that the condition is an integral part of the individual's identity and it's generally preferred by the autistic community. Interoception is the internal sense of the body's physiological condition. What that means is your hunger, your thirst, and your emotional states. Intersectionality is a framework for understanding how our various social identities, race, gender, disability, religion, sexual orientation, culture, age, intersect, and they influence our experiences of discrimination and privilege. Info dumping, often a sign of love, is sharing extensive and detailed information about a specific interest or topic, often with great enthusiasm. Late adult diagnosis or identification is the process of recognizing and or diagnosing a neurodivergent condition later in life rather than during childhood. Misophonia is a strong aversion or emotional response to specific sounds, and often it's a negative one. So it can result in anger, anxiety, or distress. Chewing seems to be a really hot button issue for people with misophonia, for example. Overwhelm is an intense state of sensory, emotional, or cognitive overload, and your ability to process information is temporarily exceeded. It's shared in neurodivergent individuals, and really, we need to be very understanding and provide supportive strategies to help people manage their environments. Parallel play is not just for children. It's a type of play where people will play or enjoy recreational activities alongside each other without directly interacting. So I might be playing on my PlayStation and you might be reading your book. And it can be a really natural and comfortable way for neurodivergent people to engage with their friends, their loved ones, because they can enjoy the social aspect of being present with someone else without needing to directly interact. PDA stands for pathological demand avoidance, and it's a profile within the autism spectrum, which is recognised in America, but not so much in the UK. But it's characterised by an extreme avoidance of everyday demands and expectations due to high anxiety. It's just overloading. And recognising that helps you to understand that the person with PDA needs autonomy, and you can reduce the pressure on them. Often, using declarative language, as I talked about earlier, is a helpful way of helping people to manage their anxiety around demands. Penguin pebbling is a metaphor for the way some autistic people show affection or build relationships, and they give small, meaningful tokens or gestures, just like penguins do. Masking is the act of concealing your natural neurodivergent traits to fit in with neurotypical expectations. That can be exhausting and it can be really detrimental to your mental health. We need to provide environments where individuals can be their authentic selves. Mirroring is the conscious or unconscious imitation of another person's speech, behavior, or mannerisms in an attempt to connect with the other person or understand the social interactions. Neurodivergent individuals often use this strategy to navigate social situations. Meltdowns are intense emotional responses that often result from sensory or emotional overload. They're not tantrums, they're expressions of extreme distress, and they require a supportive and non judgmental response. People are not likely to be able to take in information or have a reasoned discussion at the point that a meltdown hits. And they're a little bit like an iceberg. You might be able to avoid it for a little while, but there's going to be a lot going on under the surface. The medical model is a framework that looks at neurodivergent traits and conditions as medical issues to be treated or cured. This model often contrasts with the social model, which emphasizes acceptance and making accommodations for people. Moral compass. That's the internal guide that helps people to distinguish right from wrong and make ethical decisions. Neurodivergent people's moral compasses may often be really strong, and they may have a really strong sense of justice, empathy, and personal values, which can create a real deep commitment to a sense of fairness and integrity. Neuro-affirming approaches and attitudes are those which validate neurodivergent experiences, listen to neurodivergent people, and value their identities. Neuro-affirming practices emphasize respect, acceptance, and empowerment of neurodivergent individuals. Neurodivergent burnout. It's a state of extreme physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion specific to neurodivergent individuals, often resulting from prolonged masking, sensory overload, or excessive demands without adequate support. It is different to the work related stress type of burnout that happens through doing too much on the job. And often, even if people haven't realized it, there will be a sensory component to it. Neurodivergent inertia is the difficulty in starting, stopping, or switching tasks due to the different ways neurodivergent brains process information and handle transitions. Neurotypical is simply somebody whose neurological development and functioning aligns with societal norms. So it is the person who has developed in line with the majority of other people. Neuro-inclusive refers to environments, practices, and policies that accommodate and celebrate neurodiversity and ensure that neurodivergent individuals are valued and supported. The neurodiversity paradigm is a perspective that values neurological differences as natural variations of human diversity rather than as deficits or disorders, and it advocates for acceptance and inclusion of all neurotypes. The neurodiversity movement is a social and political movement that promotes the rights and acceptance of neurodivergent people. It, it wants to change society's attitudes, reduce stigma, and make sure that policies are more inclusive and supportive of neurodivergent people. Neurospicy. Be aware this can be considered a slur if it's co opted by non neurodivergent people or neurotypical people. It's a colloquial term used within the neurodivergent community to describe someone with a neurodivergent brain. It's playful, it's positive, but it needs to be used with sensitivity and respect, especially by those outside the community. Neurotype is essentially an individual's specific neurological configuration. Both neurotypical and neurodivergent are neurotypes that recognize the diversity of brain functioning. Non speaking describes people who don't use verbal speech as their primary mode of communication. Non speaking people can use alternative methods such as AAC, which is augmentative and alternative communication, to express themselves, like this lady here who's got an AAC board. Object permanence. The understanding that objects continue to exist even when they cannot be seen, heard, or otherwise sensed is essential in cognitive development, but it sometimes develops differently in neurodivergent individuals. For many people, the phrase out of sight, out of mind best captures this, which is why some of us struggle, particularly me, with losing items, particularly keys, or finishing tasks. Object personification is when you give human characteristics to inanimate objects, which can be a common and meaningful way for people to interact with their environment. And it's sometimes why neurodivergent people have special objects that they want to carry around with them. Over or understimulation refers to variations in sensory processing or sensory sensitivities. So when we experience too much overstimulation or too little understimulation sensory input, we can feel pretty unhappy. Both require tailored strategies to create a balanced sensory environment, um, but understimulation can be physically painful for people with ADHD. Palilalia is the, I've said that wrong. Palilaya is the repetition of your own words or phrases, and it often happens for people who are neurodivergent. It can be a way to process thoughts, it can be a way to self regulate. For example, saying it's okay if you're feeling anxious or overwhelmed. And it can serve as a form of self reassurance and it can help you calm down. Processing speed is the rate at which you perceive, understand, and respond to information. Neurodivergent individuals might have differences in processing speed that can require accommodations to support best functioning. That's because the amount of information, sensory information that's taken in, is often much higher. I think for individuals with ADHD, it's something like 2.5 times the amount of sensory information taken in than neurotypical people. And for people with other neurodivergences, I'm not sure, but I believe autistic people are about twice the information taken in any one time per second as neurotypical people. Proprioception is the sense of where your body is in kind of space and the strength and effort being employed in movement. It's often why I will bump into tables because I have poor proprioception. I'm a little bit clumsy. I don't always know where I am. And that varies between individuals, as with all things, but it can affect your coordination and your spatial awareness. Oh, puzzle pieces. These can be used as a symbol for autism by non-autistic organisations, and they've been criticised highly because it implies that autistic people are puzzling or they're incomplete. The community increasingly prefers symbols that represent diversity and inclusivity without the negative connotations. Often the infinity symbol is used. So just have a look at what the autistic community are suggesting. Rabbit hole is the experience of becoming deeply absorbed in a specific topic or activity. For neurodivergent individuals, it's a form of hyperfocus and it can lead to deep knowledge and expertise. Reasonable adjustments are changes or accommodations that are made to support neurodivergent individuals in different environments, ensuring they have equal access and opportunities to neurotypical people. Rejection sensitive dysphoria is often common in neurodivergent people, and it's intense emotional sensitivity and pain that's triggered by perceived or actual rejection, criticism, or failure. And sometimes just because it's perceived doesn't mean it was intended, but it can be very distressing. Safe or same foods are preferences for specific foods that provide comfort and predictability. If you eat some blueberries, some of them might be sweet, some of them might be sour. You don't know by looking at them. So you can't predict what they're going to taste like. Whereas if I open a packet of Oreos, I'm pretty sure every Oreo is going to taste like an Oreo. So having those preferences for safe foods that are going to be predictable can be necessary for managing some sensory sensitivities and making sure that people are getting enough nutrition in. Self-diagnosis and self-identification is the process by which a person recognizes and identifies their own neurodivergent traits or conditions. And that is a completely valid and essential aspect of neurodivergent identity and self-understanding. There are so many barriers, huge waiting lists. real difficulty in accessing formal diagnoses. And there is a whole generation of people who were missed in this identification process because either they were girls and it wasn't thought that girls could be neurodivergent, or because they present in a different way to the stereotypical um, version of, childlike, really, versions of what is expected to be neurodivergent. Um, and a lot of people got missed. So a lot of people can't afford the cost of a diagnosis. And if you're on a waiting list for 5 years, that's going to cause people some distress if they, are waiting up until that time for someone to, make those reasonable adjustments. Sensory processing disorder is difficulty processing and integrating sensory information, and you can have atypical responses to sensory stimuli. So, you might have as well an exceptional ability to focus on fine details, and that can help in careers and hobbies that need precision. So, art, design, craftsmanship, scientific research. Selective amnesia, that's the inability to recall specific information. It's not just related to neurodivergence, but it can be. Um, and it's related to processing differences, trauma, or stress. Shutdowns are the kind of best friend of meltdowns, if you like. So, again, it's a response to overwhelming stress or sensory input, but people become non responsive and they withdraw from interaction. And adults have shutdowns and meltdowns too, and I think that's really important to note. Social anxiety disorder is an intense fear and avoidance of social situations due to embarrassment, self consciousness, or fear of being judged or rejected by others. And again, this is not infrequently found in neurodivergent people because of the way that they've been treated a lot of the time, and the misunderstandings that they encounter. Social communication is the use of language and nonverbal behaviors to interact and communicate with other people. Social imagination is understanding and predicting other people's thoughts, feelings, and intentions. The social model of disability is a framework that views disability as the result of societal barriers and a lack of accommodations, rather than an individual's condition. This model emphasizes the need for inclusive practices and environments. What it's saying is the condition in and of itself isn't disabling, it's the environment around it that causes the problems for the person with the condition. Special interests, intense, passionate interests that bring joy and fulfillment. Special interest can be a source of deep knowledge and expertise and a means of self regulation and comfort for neurodivergent individuals. So, some people are really into music, some people are really into art. You name it, there will be someone with a special interest in it. And it brings people a lot of joy. Spiky profile. That's the uneven skill levels that many neurodivergent people have. So they'll have strength in some areas and challenges in others. So, for example, they might be able to do some really high level PhD science stuff, but they might struggle with being able to maintain their home. Or they might be able to drive a car, but they might not be able to tie a shoelace. Um, that's what we mean by a spiky profile, and it isn't true of every single neurodivergent person, but it is quite common. Spoon theory. It's a metaphor used to describe the limited energy resources if you've got a chronic condition. So each activity, getting up, eating breakfast, putting clothes on, requires a spoon of energy, and managing these spoons is crucial for well-being. It was used by the autistic community, but it originally came the, from people trying to explain what it was like to have a chronic pain condition. Um, but yeah, it's definitely worth a deep dive and a look. Stimming is self-stimulatory behaviors. So that could be hand flapping, rocking, repeating sounds, and it can help people to self-regulate and manage their sensory input. It's a natural and essential part of many neurodivergent people's lives, and it really is quite a healthy and wonderful thing to do. So if you enjoy stimming, do it. It will always kind of make you feel better. In fact, look for opportunities to schedule it into your day. Synesthesia is a condition where one sense is connected to another. For example, a person with synesthesia might hear music and automatically see colours, or read a number and taste a flavour. So, for example, the number 4 might be orange, and rock music might taste like Parma violets. And it just happens because the brain links different sensory experiences together in really unique ways. Task pairing is a strategy that involves combining a less preferred task, for me that would be cleaning, with a more enjoyable or easier one to increase motivation and productivity. So it might be doing some cleaning, but also doing it while listening to some music. Task paralysis is a state where someone feels unable to start or continue a task, and that can be due to overwhelming feelings of anxiety, executive functioning differences. Neurodivergent individuals may experience task paralysis when it feels too complex, the task is unclear, or the whole thing's too daunting, and they can really struggle to start. Traits are characteristics or behaviours that are commonly associated with certain neurodivergent conditions. Tone policing is criticizing how something is said rather than addressing the content of what is said. And this often dismisses very valid points of neurodivergent individuals, particularly when they're expressing frustration or anger. Toxic positivity. It's the excessive promotion of positive thinking while dismissing or invalidating negative emotions. And that fails to acknowledge genuine struggles and feelings of neurodivergent individuals. And that can lead to further isolation and stress. I've got another little video on that. Tourette syndrome. The most famous person I could find with Tourette syndrome was Billie Eilish. It's a neurological condition, and it's characterized by involuntary movements and vocalizations, which are called tics. Tragedy narrative. Many non autistic organizations are criticized for this, and it's framing neurodivergence as a tragic experience and a source of continuous trauma. It's not a good look. Trichotillomania. It's a condition which is characterized by the recurrent urge to pull out one's hair, resulting in noticeable hair loss. I think for some it is likely to be a form of stim. Vestibular, which relates to your body sense of balance and spatial orientation. Neurodivergent individuals will have variations in vestibular processing. That's why sometimes people might walk on their toes, or they might move their arms differently when they're balancing, or they might find heights particularly unnerving. But it affects your coordination and your movement. Waiting mode is the state where you are mentally and physically prepared for an upcoming task or event, but you can't do anything until the specific conditions are met. So if you have an appointment and you know it's coming and you're kind of prepared for it, you might not be able to do anything for the whole rest of the day. And neurodivergent people might find waiting mode quite challenging, particularly due to transitions in time management difficulties. And that is 113 words and phrases related to neurodivergence that may come in handy as you navigate the interesting waters of reading further and wider afield around neurodiversity and neurodivergence.